A reading from Deuteronomy chapter 25. When men have a dispute, they are to take it to court, and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make him lie down and have him flogged in his presence, with the number of lashes his crime deserves. But he must not give him more than 40 lashes. If he is flogged more than that, your brother will be degraded in your eyes. Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, "My husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me." Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, "I do not want to marry her," his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, "This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line." That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. If two men are fighting and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband from his assailant, she reaches out and seizes him by his private parts, you shall cut off her hand. Show her no pity. Do not have two differing weights in your bag, one heavy, one light. Do not have two differing measures in your house, one large, one small. You must have accurate and honest weights and measures, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. For the Lord your God detests anyone who does these things, anyone who deals dishonestly. Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and cut off all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all your enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. Well, another chapter of laws. But again, how do they speak to us today, thousands of years later, in a different time and a different culture? Well, they're all about justice. First of all, verses 1 to 3, justice for the guilty. A judge, we read, is to act justly and not hand out excessive punishment. Those on trial are to be allowed due process at court. The sentence must be given by those authorised to do so. Punishment must be supervised so that it's not excessive and is to be appropriate to the crime. Verse 3. A brother or fellow Israelite is not to be degraded, dignity to be upheld. So a criminal has rights to be protected, dignity to be maintained. Apply those to our treatment of those we believe to be guilty. At first sight, we could say that verse 4 is about justice to animals. Certainly, that would reinforce and be consistent with what we read in chapter 14. The ox, while doing its work, should be allowed to eat the grain that has fallen on the floor. It matters how we treat animals. But remember, the Apostle Paul uses this passage twice. First of all, 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 8 and 10. Do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because whoever ploughs and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing the harvest. Paul is asking if God is more concerned for the ox than for those doing gospel work, making the point that if God is concerned that an ox receives care and food and rights, then so should those doing gospel ministry. He repeats it again in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 18, also picking up what Jesus says in Luke 10 verse 7. For scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. So yes, on the one hand, we're to care for animals, but even more so, we are to care for those who do gospel ministry. Whether that's making sure we pay them a fair wage, they have reasonable housing, food, shelter, clothing. We have a duty to those going about God's ministry. Then moving on, verses 5 to 10, this is about justice for wives, for sons, about maintaining inheritance. Now, the specifics might not apply in our society, but there is an overall principle here. Widows are to be cared for. Widows are to be treated justly. The vulnerable are to be treated fairly. And again, Paul picks this up in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Verse 8, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Then verse 16, if any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. So the principle of family, taking care of family members first, so that they're not a burden on the church. But of course that widow, that vulnerable person who doesn't have family to take care of them, the church has a responsibility to care for them. Then it goes on, if a man refuses to do so, back in Deuteronomy, then verse 9, he faces public humiliation. It's about forfeiting the right to the brother's property. Having a sandal removed, and contempt is shown to him. So there are consequences, public consequences. That's how important this is to God, that we care and treat fairly the vulnerable. Then verses in 11 and 12, there's a section about an intervening wife. Although intervening to help the persecuted is encouraged in Deuteronomy, care has to be taken. Here, the woman should think through the consequences of her actions, because she could, in this instance, by her actions, cause infertility, which would lead to childlessness, and then the loss of inheritance or the loss of the family name. A man's genitals were also a sign through circumcision of the covenant relationship between God and his people. So by her actions, she's showing disregard for that covenant relationship. And that's why the punishment is so severe. And interestingly, this is the only place in the Old Testament where physical mutilation is allowed. Any intervention on behalf of the persecuted, the marginalised, the vulnerable, must be thoughtful, think through the consequences, appropriate and controlled. Then we get on to a section about justice or honesty in trading and business. Remember, cheating leads to distrust and disputes, and that's what undermines a community, be it family, church or state. And notice how God views it. He detests it. And that's putting dishonesty in business on the same level as idolatry and sexual sin. It's dishonesty before God is seeking to defraud others. So act honestly in your business dealings. And that may even come down to, for most of us, actually just returning change when we've been given too much, or when the price label on something have been changed by someone else. Be honest in your business dealings, because God views it as incredibly serious when we're not. And then there's a final few verses about the Amalekites. They'd attacked the people of Israel on their journey, but they'd attacked at the back. They'd attacked the weak, the disabled, the elderly, the vulnerable. We read verse 18 that the people of Israel, they're tired, they're weary. So this was inappropriate action against the disadvantaged. And that makes it, for God, a capital offence. But notice verse 18, why did they do it? They had no fear of God. It was a religious attack. When our lack of love for God allows us to take advantage of the disadvantaged, God is angry and will take action against us. And the reverse is true as well, isn't it? That part of our Christian response will be to make sure that the disadvantaged are not taken advantage of. So again, from our Bible reading, actually amazingly practical principles for our living in 21st century Britain. The rights of those on trial are to be protected, the dignity of the guilty upheld. Well, does our judicial and prison system do that? How do we treat wrongs within the church family? If animals are to receive care, then how much more should those in gospel ministry? Do we give a good salary or payment to those who work for the church? Decent housing? Widows are to be cared for. We're to think about the consequences of our actions. Even when our motivation is good, there might be unforeseen consequences. About having honesty in our business relationships. Okay, it's okay to defraud the Inland Revenue, is it? Don't think God would say so. Defend the weak, the disadvantaged. So a reading that actually has a lot to say to us in 21st century Britain for our lives in community and our lives in the church.